Hey guys, tonight we step into a world that will test your nose, your stomach, and maybe even your faith in human progress. Imagine the damp creak of uneven cobblestones beneath your boots, the oily torchlight flickering against grime-covered walls, and a the smell so thick it feels like it has a weight of its own. This isn't just dirt, it's rot, it's sweat, it's decades of human filth baked into the bones of a city that hasn't seen a sewer system since the Romans packed up and left. You walk past a butcher's stall where flies outnumber the meat, then sidestep something squishy you hope is just a cabbage. This isn't a dungeon or a cursed village, it's a thriving medieval town, and you're right in the middle of it. And just a heads up, you probably won't survive this journey with your sense of smell intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and your current time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're retuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The moment you step through the city gates, the smell hits you like a slap soaked in vinegar and despair. This is not a matter of exaggeration. Chroniclers of the time often remarked on the overwhelming stench of medieval cities. Streets were not paved with gold, they were paved with excrement, mud, spoiled food, and decomposing animals. Waste disposal. You're reliving in a time when the term sanitation infrastructure might as well be black magic. Human and animal waste alike were dumped straight into the streets. The idea was simple. Let gravity and rain take care of it. The problem? It rarely rained enough. Even when it did, runoff simply shifted the filth from one unlucky street to the next. You walk past an alleyway where a rat the size of a cat scampers over a dead dog that no one has bothered to move in days. This isn't out of place, it's just Tuesday. Historians still argue whether cities like London or Paris were filthier, but consensus agrees. They were both horror shows of hygiene. The urban layout did not help. Narrow alleyways, trapped smells, and tightly packed buildings allowed no breeze to escape the dense, acidic air. People lived directly above where they worked and defecated, often without separation. A butcher's shop might be next to a dye house, using stale urine to fix color, with a family of 8 sleeping upstairs. Speaking of urine, it was a staple used for tanning leather, cleaning clothes, and even brushing teeth. It was soaked into everything. The walls, the fabric, the very air you breathe. And as you breathe, you realize your lungs ache just a little from the constant smoke. Wood fires, charcoal burners, forges all, adding layers of soot to your nose and lungs. Indoor ventilation was nearly non-existent, so the inside of homes wasn't much better. A smoky interior filled with fleas, damp straw mattresses, and mildew made for a lovely domestic aroma. But outside was worse. The soundscape alone is nauseating. Squelching mud, buzzing flies, coughing children, and the occasional squawk of a goose that's escaped its fate. Then there's the tanneries. Ever wonder what happens to animal carcasses after you skin them? They're thrown into massive vats, along with dog dung and more urine, left to rot and soften before being turned into leather. You pass one such shop, and even in this dreamlike wander through time, your senses recoil. The leather workers don't seem to notice. They've gone nose-blind to their own apocalypse. And you might be wondering, weren't there any regulations? Actually, yes. In theory, medieval cities had rudimentary laws about waste disposal. Some towns forbade throwing garbage into the streets during certain hours, or mandated that waste be carried a bowshot outside city walls. But enforcement was lax, especially when the officials were just as filthy as everyone else. Let's say you wanted to report your neighbor for throwing pig guts out the window. Congratulations, you've now involved yourself in a dispute that could last months and likely end in someone challenging you to a duel. So, you keep walking. The smell intensifies near the marketplace, where stalls display produce beside dead animals with bloated, fly-laden bellies. There's no refrigeration, of course, so meats are preserved in salt when available or just sold quickly before they rot completely. You pass a fishmonger whose goods smell like they were caught last summer, and a baker whose pies are steaming, not from the oven, but from sitting in the sun too long. Quirky fact: some medieval folks used dried flowers and aromatic herbs in their shoes to block out street smells. But it wasn't fashion, it was survival. And those with wealth, they didn't avoid the stench. They just elevated themselves above it literally. Upper-class houses were taller, with more windows and higher stories, putting them above the worst of the street-level filth. Even then, it was no palace. Those windows were often unglazed, open to air and, unfortunately, to whatever their neighbors were flinging from theirs. Rainwater carried muck down hills, and the rich neighborhoods, while slightly cleaner, still reeked of soot, horse manure, and body odor. Because here's the real kicker: even if the streets were swept and, occasionally, they were, the people themselves weren't exactly fresh daisies either. We'll get to that more later. But remember this: in a world where water is risky and soap is a luxury, hygiene isn't a daily habit. It's a rumor. You keep moving. Past a slaughterhouse, where pigs are being gutted into a canal, so black and slow-moving, you can tell if it's water or tar. A dog barks at you, caked in filth and limping, but no one pays it any mind. You see a child, barefoot, stepping through sludge without blinking. It's normal. This is life. This is home. A normal medieval day in a clean city. Think things were better in rural areas. Maybe if you consider sharing your hut with goats and chickens, an improvement. At least the air had a chance to move out there. In towns, it just sits festering. You pass another alley, and a group of men is relieving themselves directly onto a wall. They're not being indecent. They're just making do. Public latrines exist in theory, but they're rare and, frankly, even worse than going outside. You'd need a full hazmat suit to survive one. Even the rivers aren't safe. People use them for everything: washing, drinking, dumping. Waste and wonder why cholera sweeps through like a scythe every few years. It's not just gross. It's deadly. But you're here, and you're surviving for now. So, you pull your cloak tighter, breathe through your mouth. Not that it helps. And keep walking through a time when cities were living, breathing organisms, and hygiene was just a forgotten dream. You reach a fountain. It's beautiful, stone-carved, with an angel pouring water into a basin. But don't get too excited. That water's likely been tampered with, redirected from a spring miles away, and contaminated 3 times before reaching you. Still, it's cleaner than most of what you've seen today. You lean closer, listening to the trickle, trying to find some peace in this madhouse of filth. And just for a moment, you wonder, how did people survive this? The answer: many didn't. But somehow, life found a way, even here, in the midst of rot, stink, and decay. Welcome to to the medieval city. You've only just begun to smell the surface. UVA managed to survive, the streets barely, and your sense of smell is still reeling from the constant assault. But now, as you tread deeper into the town's twisted labyrinth of alleys and overhanging timber houses, an urgent biological truth kicks in. Nature calls. You clutch your stomach, wondering, where exactly do people in this world relieve themselves? Surely, in a place with as much structure and ritual as medieval society, there's some kind of designated bathroom system. Right, that naive hope crumbles the moment you look up and see a woman casually emptying a ceramic pot out of her window, its contents splattering dangerously close to a man below who shouts and leaps out of the way a second too late. That, my friend, was a chamber pot, basically the medieval version of an indoor toilet, and far more sinister than it sounds. The average household didn't have plumbing, so each family kept a pot, sometimes ceramic, sometimes wooden, often unwashed, tucked discreetly under the bed or in a corner. You feel a rising dread as you realize what this means. Every home, every floor, every bedchamber could be hiding one of these little ticking stick bombs. In the middle of the night, or whenever someone needed to go, they simply didn't to the pot. And in the morning, those pots had to be emptied somewhere. The street was the easiest target. The ritual of gardes l'eau, a cry in medieval French meaning watch out for the water, was shouted as a warning, but you imagined it did little to save anyone from a messy surprise. It wasn't law, but it was polite. Sometimes people didn't even bother with the warning. Imagine walking home from a tavern at midnight, tipsy and laughing, only to be baptized in someone else's digestive regrets. Congratulations, you've been christened by the city. And this wasn't just in the poorest districts. Even relatively wealthy households relied on chamber pots. Some castles had rudimentary privates, essentially holes in the wall, with a shaft leading down to the moat or a pit butt. Even these could clog, overflow, or become infested. You pause to consider the horror of a castle siege, not because of starvation or arrows, but because no one's been able to empty the latrines for 2 weeks. And speaking of pits, let's talk about cesspit stoves, underground repositories of filth that lurked beneath homes and businesses. When chamber pots weren't emptied into the street or river, their contents were poured into these pits, which slowly filled up over months or years. But there was a problem. No one wanted to deal with them. Enter the gong farmers, possibly the most unfortunate profession in medieval Europe. These brave, perpetually reeking souls made a living by climbing into cesspits and scooping out decades of human waste with buckets. You feel your stomach churn at the thought, especially when you realize they often worked at night to avoid offending the public as a delicate noses. The pay was surprisingly high, but no one envied them. Their clothes absorbed the smell permanently. Their social standing was, unsurprisingly, subterranean. And yet without them, cities would have drowned in their own excrement. Historians still argue whether gong farmers were technically city-employed or private contractors, but either way, they were essentially unloved. As you trudge forward, holding your breath each time you pass a dark corner, you start noticing the smears and stains that mark where chamber pots missed their target. They streak down walls, coagulate in street gutters, and turn every puddle into a guessing game. Children, barefoot and carefree, skip through these paths. You flinch, but no one else bats an eye. This is just part of growing up in a world where plumbing is a fantasy. Public latrines did exist, but they were rare, filthy, and often dangerous. You hear a whispered rumor about a man who fell through a rotted seat and drowned in the pit below. Whether it's true or not, you don't want to test it. Most people avoided public latrines unless absolutely necessary. Women, in particular, had a harder time. Modesty and mobility weren't exactly priorities in urban design. So many women relied entirely on chamber pots and the rare private corner behind their home. When you ask where the waste goes from there, someone gestures vaguely toward the river. Speaking of which, take a good look at the water flowing beneath that small stone bridge. It looks deceptively clean from a distance, but as you approach, you see the film of grease, the drifting clumps, the rainbow shimmer of decay. This river is where people dump waste, wash clothes, water their animals, and sometimes draw drinking water. You suddenly remember how the bubonic plague spread like wildfire, and everything makes a little more sense. But let's not forget the horses. There are no cars, but the streets are full of traffic, and horses are less discreet than humans when it comes to relieving themselves. The average medieval city had hundreds, sometimes thousands, of animals clomping through its roads, all of them leaving their fragrant gifts behind. Horse manure was common enough that some tried to repurpose it as fertilizer, but there was always far more than anyone needed. Combined with human waste, you're walking through a soup of bacterial horror. Still, there's a weird sense of order beneath the chaos. Some guilds were tasked with street cleaning. Town criers occasionally announced when certain streets would be swept or when waste needed to be moved. There were even laws in some cities about building regulations that required homes to have waste disposal chutes, essentially vertical tubes that dropped everything from upper floors to the street below. Inventive, yes. Hygienic, not even close. One fringe tidbit you wouldn't expect. In some wealthier homes, chamber pots were decorated. Seriously. Elaborate designs, family crests, even biblical scenes. It's as if the sheer act of making waste needed a flourish of dignity. You imagine someone proudly displaying their ornate pot to a guest, and both nodding in approval before returning to their roast peacock dinner. Meanwhile, others used wooden commodes, essentially boxers with a hole in the top and a pot inside. These were slightly more comfortable, but didn't solve the core issue. The smell, which, by the way, lingered constantly. Forget scented candles or incense. The best most people could hope for was a bundle of herbs hung near the window, maybe lavender or rosemary, to slightly mask the scent of daily evacuation. If you were lucky, you lived downwind from a bakery. If unlucky, well, you're where you are right now. And while we're on the subject, imagine the challenge of being a guest in someone's home. You're invited to dinner, and halfway through the salted fish stew, you feel the pressure building. You discreetly ask for the facilities. Your host gestures under the table. The chamber pot is right there, and you're expected to use it in the same room, with everyone still talking and eating. You decide to hold it, but that only works so long. Eventually, something's gotta give. For many, that meant hurrying into the nearest alley or courtyard and hoping no one saw. Privacy was a luxury, not a right. And in some areas, especially crowded tenement-style housing, entire families shared one pot. No cleaning between uses, no water for rinsing. Just a full container passed around like a cursed family heirloom. Children were often taught from a young age how to aim and when to empty it. Accidents common, the smell constant, and in this environment, it's no wonder that disease thrived. You feel a fresh wave of nausea as a cart rolls past, trailing a smell that feels like it could peel paint. The man driving it whistles cheerfully. He's a night soil collector, one of the few who made their living by removing human waste from cesspits and selling it to farmers. That's right, sold. In many parts of Europe, particularly in agricultural zones, human waste was considered valuable fertilizer. There is a long-standing historical debate about whether this actually improved soil quality or simply spread disease more efficiently. Either way, it was a booming business. And so the city functioned in this bizarre, nauseating equilibrium: waste in, waste out, repeated endlessly, every day, every season. No one liked it, but it was the reality. You walk past a church, hoping for a moment of peace, but even holy grounds aren't exempt. Monks had privies too, often overhanging structures that dropped directly into the monastery gardens. Poetic, in a way, the sacred and the profane, side by side. It's inescapable. Waste defines the medieval experience. And if you're still wondering why no one built better systems, remember, engineering takes money, knowledge, and political will. Most cities were too busy surviving fires, famines, and invasions to worry about plumbing, so chamber pots remained the reigning monarchs of bodily relief. It's not elegant, it's not sanitary, but it worked, more or less, for centuries. And you, time-traveling nose and all, are stuck right in the middle of it. Welcome to the real Middle Ages. No fairy tale castles here, just pots, pits, and puddles. You've dodged chamber pot missiles and waded through the symphony of stink on the streets. But now you find yourself wondering about something even more personal, more primal. What about bathing? You know, that ancient human ritual of stepping into water, scrubbing the filth away, and feeling, even briefly, like a new person. Surely, even in the medieval world, they had some semblance of a bath, right? You look around and notice that no one seems particularly fresh. Faces are streaked with soot, hands are caked with grime, and clothing clings like it's absorbed decades of sweat. As it turns out, in this world, bathing is not a daily habit, it's an event, and a rare one at that. The idea of jumping into a hot bath after a long day, pure fantasy. For most people, the act of bathing happens only a few times a year, maybe 4, if they're feeling fancy. You step into a modest home to investigate, only to find that there's no bathroom at all. There's a wooden bucket, a jug, and a rag. That's it. For the majority of medieval peasants, bathing meant wiping down with a damp cloth or sitting in a washtub filled with lukewarm, reused water. And not just reused by you, your entire family likely takes turns. The children go first, then the women, then the men. By the time you get in, you're more soaking in a communal soup than actually cleaning yourself. The phrase "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," yeah, that comes from this very situation. Historians still argue whether this order of bathing was universal, but the image is compelling enough that it's stuck in the cultural consciousness. And if you think that's rough, imagine living in a town with no fresh running water. Wells were often contaminated, and transporting enough water for a full bath took time, effort, and money. Heating it was even worse. You'd need to gather firewood, light a fire, and guard it carefully to keep the water from cooling too fast. So people didn't bother. Instead, they relied on sweat, perfume, and the medieval classic, just getting used to it. But here's where it gets quirky. In some periods, especially earlier in the Middle Ages, public bathhouses were actually quite popular. People would gather in these steamy, communal spaces to wash, relax, and socialize. It wasn't necessarily about getting clean, it was more of a ritual, a way to unwind. Think of it like a spa, minus the cucumber water, and plus a lot more body odor. Men and women sometimes bathed together, depending on the region and decade, though rules changed frequently. You walk past one of these bathhouses, now long abandoned, and imagine the ghostly echoes of laughter and splashing. They weren't luxurious, but they were effective until the moral panic kicked in. But that's a story for later. Right now, you're focused on the private lives of the majority, and what you're finding isn't exactly refreshing. Soap, for example, existed, but it was wildly different from the bars you know today. Early soaps were harsh, made from animal fat and lye, and could do more damage than good. They stung the skin, left behind a filmy residue, and stripped away oils that your body desperately needed in a time of bitter winters and no moisturizers. So most people avoided soap unless absolutely necessary. Some made do with ash and sand, scrubbing themselves like human cast iron skillets. Others simply rinsed with water and hoped for the best. The smell, constant. Everyone smelled. It was a great equalizer. In fact, there's scholarly debate over whether people even noticed the stench. If you've never smelled clean, do you even know what dirty is? It's possible that the medieval nose simply recalibrated, and you, poor time-traveling wanderer, are stuck without that evolutionary numbness. Every whiff is an assault. Yet, ironically, many people believed that water itself could be dangerous. There was a widespread belief that bathing opened your pores and made you more vulnerable to illness. This wasn't entirely untrue, given the filthy water sources they used. So rather than risk sickness, people avoided baths altogether. Better to be dirty and alive than clean and dead. It's not that people didn't care about hygiene. They just had very different definitions of it. You come across a well-dressed merchant who, despite his fine clothes, hasn't bathed in weeks. He smells strongly of lavender, though, because he's dabbed a bit of perfume onto his collar. That was considered enough. Smelling nice equaled being clean. Never mind what's happening under the layers. And then there's the ritual of dry bathing, a practice where people dusted themselves with powders made of crushed flowers, herbs, and even chalk to absorb sweat and mask odor. It didn't clean anything, but it gave the illusion of freshness. You might even consider it the precursor to dry shampoo. Some nobles carried scented handkerchiefs to hold up to their noses when walking through particularly pungent streets. A quirky touch. Some folks would burn aromatic resins or keep fragrant sachets in their clothes to ward off bad humors, believed to cause illness. In some areas, particularly in Islamic regions and parts of southern Europe, bathing was more advanced. These societies maintained a strong tradition of cleanliness, often rooted in religious practice. Bathhouses flourished in Moorish Spain and the Byzantine Empire, but in the colder, wetter, and more paranoid regions of Europe, that culture slowly eroded. You see remnants of it here and there, an old tiled bath, a rusted copper basin, but they feel like relics from a more civilized age. And then came the waves of plague, which shifted things even further. People became terrified of anything that might make them vulnerable to disease, including warm water. A warm bath was believed to open invisible holes in your skin, allowing in the miasma, that foul air thought to spread sickness. So bathing became not just rare, but taboo. You start to understand why. In art and literature from the period, saints and martyrs are often described as filthy, ragged, and unwashed. Dirt became a symbol of humility, piety, even virtue. The cleaner you were, the more suspicious you became. What were you hiding under all that cleanliness? Pride, vanity, sin. You look down at your own hands, smeared with street grime, and think, maybe you're fitting in after all. At least on the outside. But your insides still scream for a hot shower. If you're lucky enough to stay at an inn, you might be offered a basin and a cloth. But don't expect privacy. The communal sleeping areas, combined with communal washing, meant that your ablutions were a group activity. Modesty, like sanitation, was optional. You remember those paintings of medieval nobles reclining in ornate tubs, servants pouring rosewater onto their heads. Yes, that happened, but only for the absolute elite, and even then, only on rare occasions. Those baths were expensive, time-consuming, and mostly ceremonial. For everyone else, hygiene meant doing the bare minimum to keep from becoming completely crusted over. Clothes weren't washed often either, which we'll explore later. But for now, just know this. When your skin itched or broke out in rashes, you didn't bathe, you prayed. Maybe rubbed on some vinegar. Maybe tried a poultice. But water, too risky. And yet, despite all this, people did what they could. They combed their hair with bone or metal combs to remove lice. They changed undergarments when they could. They aired out their bedding. They swept their floors. It wasn't anarchy, it was adaptation. A slow, steady battle against a world that just didn't offer much in the way of cleanliness. The few who did bathe regularly were often considered eccentric or suspicious. You pass one such man, known locally as the Soap Knight, who insists on bathing once a week. The townsfolk thinks he's a bit mad, maybe cursed. No one wants to sit near him at the tavern because he smells bad, but because he smells strange, foreign, wrong. You make a mental note not to stand out too much. As twilight falls, you see a woman carrying a steaming bucket from the hearth. She's going to bathe her child, a rare luxury. She pours the water into a small tub, tests the temperature, and gently lowers the child inside. It's a tender moment, one of love and care. The child giggles, splashing with abandon, unaware of how unusual this is. You watch from the shadows, struck by the realization that even in a world this grimy, there are moments of gentleness, of quiet resistance against the filth. And as you step away, the smell returns, wrapping around you like a damp cloak. The fantasy of a hot bath fades, replaced once more by the sticky reality of medieval life. You've trudged through the grime-slicked streets and shivered at the idea of communal bathwater, but now your path leads to something slightly more structured, a place where washing wasn't just a desperate act of self-preservation. It was also a social affair, an indulgence, and for a brief time, a symbol of sophistication. The public bathhouse. At first glance, you might imagine these establishments as echoey stone buildings with a few steaming tubs and modest benches. But what you find is far more layered, both literally and figuratively. The bathhouse, at its peak, was not only a place for cleaning oneself, it was a center of community life, gossip, flirtation, even politics. You arrive at one such establishment in a larger medieval town. It's a squat, timbered building with smoke puffing from a brick chimney. A modest sign swinging above the door, carved with an image of a steaming basin. As you step inside, you're met with moist, perfumed air, heavy with the scent of rosemary, lavender, and mildew. It's warm, and the haze of steam makes the torchlight shimmer, softening the outlines of bodies moving from chamber to chamber. The floors are damp stone, the walls coated in condensation, and the acoustics make every whisper carry like a secret being passed directly into your ear. In the outer rooms, people are undressing, not modestly, but casually, because this is normal. Some wear linen shifts, others go completely nude. There's little shame here. Bodies are just bodies. You find it curious, even refreshing, to see such open attitudes toward something so intimate. Men and women mingle freely in many bathhouses, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where mixed bathing wasn't always frowned upon. But it wasn't the same everywhere. In parts of France, England, and Italy, changing religious and political climates often dictated stricter gender segregation or, in some cases, outright closures of these spaces. Historians still argue whether the mixed-gender bathhouse was common or more of a regional exception. But for now, you're in one of the tolerant zones, and it's a steamy, buzzing social hive. You notice that bathing here is more of a process than a single event. First, you enter a warm room, letting your body adjust to the heat. Then proceed to the hottest chamber, where you sweat profusely in a crude sauna. The idea is to purge impurities from your body through heat, and sweat an idea that docentities sound too different from what modern spas promise. After that, you're scrubbed by an attendant using rough cloths or even handfuls of herbs, depending on how much you paid. Some attendants offer a kind of massage as well, working tired muscles and coaxing out the aches from labor and travel. Finally, there's the rinse, usually a bucket of lukewarm or cool water poured over your head, sometimes followed by an aromatic oil rub if you've got the coin. You think to yourself, maybe this is the cleanest you've seen anyone in days. But then you begin to notice the other functions of this place. In one corner, two merchants argue over grain prices while a monk listens, eyes closed, steam curling around his tonsured scalp. A young woman hums softly as she braids another's hair. A man with a scar down his cheek sips wine from a wooden goblet and winks at you. This isn't just a bath, it's a party, a deal-making hub, a matchmaking venue. And yes, sometimes something a little more salacious. The lines between hygiene and hedonism were often blurred in fact, in some cities, bathhouses developed reputations as dens of immorality. Not because people were always doing anything scandalous, but because the opportunity was always there. Where there's warm water, bare skin, and alcohol, people talk, people touch, people make plans. This overlap of cleanliness and vice became too much for certain authorities to tolerate. As religious influence grew, especially during the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the church began clamping down on bathhouses. They were seen as temptations, as breeding grounds for sin. You hear a whisper about a nearby town where bathhouses were shuttered by decree, replaced by sermons and fasting days. The official line was always the same. Cleanliness was fine, but not at the cost of one's soul. The irony, of course, was that the closure of bathhouses led directly to worse hygiene. Disease rates rose, skin conditions worsened, but morality, they argued, had been preserved. A scholar you overhear argues with a local official, questioning whether dirtiness really equated to holiness. Historians still debate whether this moral panic about nudity and social bathing was rooted in genuine spiritual concern or more about control of body's behavior and community spaces. The evidence is mixed and the debate steamy. Even during the height of bathhouse culture, there were dark undercurrents. Not everyone had access. The poor could sometimes pay a small fee, but the best rooms and services were reserved for the wealthy. Prostitutes were occasionally present, officially or unofficially, adding to the bathhouse's sultry reputation. You learn that some bathhouses even offered private stalls, an upscale version of the communal tub where anything could happen behind a drawn curtain. And in times of plague, bathhouses became scapegoats. Though they offered soap and warm water, many feared that the close quarters and humid air allowed illness to spread faster. In truth, the water itself wasn't always clean. Bathwater was reused throughout the day, growing increasingly murky with every bather. A quirky historical tidbit: some bathhouses would add scented oils, not just for luxury, but to hide how many people had used the same tub before you. You imagine the bathmaster stirring a great wooden vat with a paddle, dousing it in rosemary and lemon balm, smiling like it makes any difference. It doesn't, but it smells nicer. Still, for all the moral suspicion and microbial mystery, there's no denying the cultural importance of the bathhouse. In some towns, they were among the few places where people from different classes could mix. A farmer might end up scrubbing shoulders with a minor noble. A washerwoman could overhear secrets that shaped local politics. And while the experience was far from sterile, it was one of the few times a medieval person might feel truly pampered. You step into a side room and find a couple wrapped in linen towels, sipping warmed, spiced wine. They chat softly, their cheeks flushed from the heat. This could be any modern spa, minus the architectural decay and ever-present mildew. For a moment, it's easy to forget where you are. Then someone coughs a deep, wet sound that rattles through the walls, and you're reminded that this warmth is temporary, this luxury fragile. Outside, the filth waits. The bathhouse is a sanctuary, yes, but one built on borrowed time. You exit, your skin damp and warm, stepping back into the chill of evening. The bathhouse door closes behind you, sealing in the steam and sighs. And already, the scent of smoke and sewage curls around your nostrils once more. Any cleanliness you gained will vanish within the hour. But for a brief moment, you felt human. Not just surviving, but living. That's the strange magic of the medieval bathhouse, a place where people tried, against all odds, to feel something like comfort, something like dignity, something like hope. You've soaked in the fleeting warmth of the bathhouse scene, the mingling of steam and scandal. And now you step back into the stony veins of the medieval city, where cold stone walls replace hot tubs and cleanliness becomes an afterthought. Once again, but this time, your attention drifts toward a powerful force in society that didn't just ignore hygiene, it actively resisted it. The church. You glance at a nearby chapel, its stone face stern and silent, and you begin to understand how spiritual beliefs often clashed violently with physical practices. Because here, in this world, cleanliness wasn't necessarily next to godliness. In fact, sometimes it was seen as directly opposed. The church held immense power over people's minds and bodies, dictating everything from what they wore to when they could eat, whom they could marry, and yes, how often or whether they should bathe. You might think, in all its solemn glory, the medieval church would have advocated for cleanliness as a path to purity. But strangely, the opposite was often true. You find yourself in the company of a traveling friar, his robes worn and fragrant in a way that could knock over a horse, and he tells you with an air of authority that the body is merely a vessel for the soul, and to care too much for its comfort or cleanliness is a sign of vanity and weakness. Washing oneself, especially too frequently or with pleasure, was often considered indulgent or even sinful. Austerity was sacred. Dirt was devotion. The saints, after all, were often portrayed as filth-covered figures who scorned worldly comfort, and women who let lice crawl across their skin and sores blossom unchecked as proof of their piety. Cleanliness in that context became a temptation of the flesh. You walk through a cloister where monks tend to their gardens, their hands blackened with soil, their robes stiff with grime, and though they occasionally wash as part of ritual purification, their daily routines avoid any excess that might suggest a longing for comfort. It's not that the church outright banned washing it, as that they discouraged anything that might hint at pride or sensuality. You overhear a sermon in a modest stone chapel where the priest warns his congregation that warm baths awaken sinful thoughts, that soaking the body can soften the soul, that God does not care for the outer shell. Historians still argue whether these attitudes were genuinely rooted in theology or more about controlling the populace's behavior through fear and humility. But the effect was undeniable. Cleanliness became suspect, and this suspicion extended beyond individual practices into architectural decisions. Many monasteries and nunneries were deliberately built with minimal washing facilities, and those that did have water systems used them sparingly. You learn of some orders that allowed full bathing only a few times a year, once before Easter, perhaps once again before Christmas. Any more than that was considered indulgent. And in case you're thinking this was just a fringe belief, consider that many members of the nobility, heavily influenced by the church's moral compass, began to adopt similar habits. A noble woman might avoid washing her body except for her hands and face, lest she be seen as immodest. A lord might boast of how rarely he bathed, proudly presenting his unwashed flesh as evidence of his spiritual discipline. And then there's soaplets. Talk about soap. While soap making existed and was practiced in parts of medieval Europe, particularly in the Islamic world, where hygiene was a cornerstone of daily life, in Christian-dominated regions, soap often carried a strange, contradictory reputation. You find a small soap-maker's workshop nestled near a river, its shelves stacked with lumpy bars of olive oil and ash mixtures, their scent earthy and harsh. The soap maker explains how he sells mostly to travelers and foreigners. Locals prefer to scrub with sand or simply skip washing altogether. There is an air of suspicion around his work, as though producing something that brings physical cleanliness is meddling too much in the affairs of the flesh. Even when soap was used, it wasn't always applied to the whole body. Hair, for instance, was rarely washed with soap. It was brushed and powdered instead. The idea of full-body cleansing was seen as exotic, perhaps even dangerous. You come across a letter being read aloud in a town square, written by a cleric warning of a nearby kingdom where women reportedly bathe daily and wear scented oils. The audience murmurs in disgust. The implication is clear. Those people are too clean. And cleanliness, in this context, equals corruption. A fringe tidbit floats your way from an elderly nun who chuckles as she recounts the story of a hermit saint who lived in the desert for decades without ever bathing, surviving on dew and the occasional locust, and was canonized, not just for his faith, but for his stench, which was seen as a badge of eternal endurance. You try not to imagine what he smelled like by the end. The church's influence didn't just affect behavior, colored the language and the metaphors people used. Sin was often described as filth of the soul, while repentance was a form of internal cleansing. But rarely was this mirrored by physical washing. Instead, rituals like confession, penance, and fasting were the tools of spiritual hygiene. Soap and water couldn't scrub away sin. So what was the point? You begin to notice how even architecture reflects these beliefs. The churches are lofty, cool, and dry, their walls decorated not with imagery of fresh rivers and blooming gardens, but of fire, blood, suffering, and sanctity through denial. Water features are symbolic fountains that trickle with a trickle of sacred meaning, but not for bathing. Baptism, the most important water-based ritual, happens once, with a few drops or a ceremonial dunk, and never again. It's about rebirth of the spirit, not rinsing away the grime. You sit in the nave of a large cathedral, watching as townsfolk filter in, their clothes dusty, their skin blotched with sun and soot, and yet no one seems bothered. They kneel, cross themselves, and pray, their physical appearance entirely disconnected from their perceived moral standing. And you realize something: essential cleanliness wasn't a moral obligation. It was almost a threat to humility. Too much care for your appearance suggested you valued your body too highly. The faithful were expected to accept the discomfort of filth, to embrace it as a necessary hardship in a sinful world. And while not everyone agreed, there were always outliers. Always quiet voices advocating for balance. The dominant voice of the church echoed through the stones of every village and every soul. Even medical advice was colored by theology. Some priests doubled as healers, but their treatments often ignored the physical entirely in favor of spiritual remedies. Illness, they taught, was a punishment or a test, and washing would not help. Prayer might, pilgrimage might. Washing, only if it was part of a sacred rite. In your travels, you meet a lay healer who speaks of herbs and ointments, of vinegar rinses and warm cloths, but even she hesitates when asked about bathing. She glances over her shoulder, as if expecting a priest to appear and rebuke her. That fear, that lingering sense of guilt for simply wanting to feel clean, permeates every layer of medieval life. And yet, beneath all that doctrine and disapproval, the human instinct remains. You pass a group of children splashing in a muddy stream, laughing and shrieking, free from the weight of moral codes. An old man pours a bucket of rainwater over his head behind a stable, sighing with relief. A young woman crushes lavender into her hair, not because the church told her to, but because she wants to smell like something other than despair. These small acts of resistance, of instinctual cleanliness, flicker like candles in the dark. And perhaps that's the true story of medieval hygiene, not that people were ignorant, but that they were often discouraged, even punished, for seeking the most basic forms of bodily care. The church didn't need to outlaw bathing, it just needed to suggest that it was unholy. That suggestion, whispered from pulpits and echoed in doctrine, was enough to keep generations swaddled in filth and convinced it was virtue. And now, as you step once more into the filth-caked street, the scent of wood smoke and waste closing around you, you understand that medieval hygiene was, indeed, just about what people did or didn't do it, was about what they were told to believe. Cleanliness wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous, it was subversive. It was, in the eyes of many, ungodly. You wince as a toothache flares imaginary. For now, as you wander deeper into the world of medieval hygiene, where your mouth, that soft cave of vulnerability, was anything but sacred, you pass a smiling merchant, or at least what looks like a smile, until you realize he's missing half his teeth, and the remaining ones are blackened like burnt twigs in a dying campfire. You glance down at your reflection in a bucket of murky water, and suddenly your own teeth feel far too modern. You're used to toothbrushes, floss, fluoride, maybe even a cheeky whitening strip. But here the tools of oral care range from absurd to terrifying. You duck into a bustling medieval kitchen where sweetmeats sizzle and rot in equal measure. And you wonder how people manage to chew anything in this time. The answer, mostly, is that they didn't for long. Dental decay was rampant. Sugar wasn't common for the poor, but grains and dried fruits got stuck in teeth just the same. And the absence of regular cleaning meant bacterial feasts happened daily. You rub your jaw sympathetically as a woman bites into a crust of stale bread. A quiet crunch echoing not just from the bread, but likely from one of her molars cracking apart. But didn't they have any remedies? You reach for a wooden bowl filled with aromatic herbs, sage, mint, cloves, and discovered that yes, they did, sort of. These herbs were chewed to freshen breath and sometimes rubbed against the teeth with cloth, a rudimentary form of brushing. A few wealthier individuals might have used twigs, their ends frayed into bristles. But without understanding plaque or enamel, the practice was more for comfort than prevention. And when a tooth finally gave out, well, that's when things got grim. You're led to a square where a local barber surgeon is pulling teeth. Yes, the same man who cuts hair, drains abscesses, and occasionally amputates limbs, now waves a pair of pliers, more accurately, rusted metal tongs in the air, while his assistant tries to hold down a struggling, red-faced man in a stool. The crowd watches with morbid interest, and when the bloody tooth is finally yanked free with a squelch and a scream, someone even claps. Pain relief. If you were lucky, you got a stiff drink. If you were devout, you got a prayer. Historians still argue whether tooth extractions were seen as medical necessities or last-ditch punishments for those who failed to maintain God's temple. But either way, the results were the same. Broken jaws, infected gums, and breath that could knock over a stable boy at 20 paces. Speaking of breath, halitosis wasn't just common, it was expected. You couldn't rely on toothpaste because it didn't exist, though there were early pastes made from crushed eggshells, ash, and sometimes even powdered charcoal. One particularly grim recipe included burnt goat hooves. And if that wasn't quirky enough, you find a monk copying herbal remedies who casually mentions that stale urine was sometimes used to whiten teeth. Yes, you heard that right. Urine contains ammonia, and while technically it can bleach things, the smell alone would make you think twice. Still, there's a record of upper-class Romans doing it before medieval times, and the occasional bold medieval experimenter didn't mind giving it a go. That's commitment, or desperation. And yet, perhaps the oddest thing is the relative indifference toward dental pain. You pass by a household where a grandmother calmly carves an apple with gums alone. No teeth, none at all. She just laughs when the kids ask her how she eats. You overhear tales in a tavern of noblemen whose entire jaws rotted away, and no one seems shocked. Teeth were like tools, once broken, tossed aside. The idea of saving them, repairing them, was alien. Fillings, crowns, dental hygiene as maintenance, not even in fantasy. And yet the nobility tried to put on a better face. You peek into the boudoir of a wealthy lady who dabs a cloth soaked in rosewater on her lips, then chews a bit of cinnamon bark for breath. She smiles at her mirror, revealing uneven, browning teeth, but they are, at least, her own. Some noblemen resorted to false teeth made from ivory or wood, sometimes tied together with silk threads and jammed into place. Not exactly subtle, not exactly secure. You imagine one popping out during a feast and landing in a goblet of mead, and suddenly everyone's appetite evaporates. Children fared no better. You watch a boy wince as he tries to chew boiled beans, his swollen gums a sure sign of infection. No dental visits, no relief. And with nutrition often lacking in essential vitamins, scurvy-like symptoms, bleeding gums, loosening teeth were disturbingly common even far from the sea. There is a debate among historians about whether certain religious fasts and restrictive diets contributed to tooth loss. But what's clear is that the damage wasn't just from sugar. It was systemic. And still, some people tried. You find a tiny scroll listing homemade mouth rinses vinegar with salt, honey mixed with crushed fennel seeds, mint infusions, and you marvel at the effort. Not everyone gave up. Some wanted to feel clean, even if it was a battle against both ignorance and rot. And then there's the social aspect. You're at a wedding where the guests are dressed in their finest. The wine flows freely, and everyone is smiling or trying to. A good smile was seen as a sign of nobility, beauty, even moral goodness. So people tried to protect it, despite having few tools. You overhear a bride being told to keep a clove in her mouth at all times, not just for freshness, but to mask the inevitable taste of decay. Her husband nods approvingly, his own teeth already a battlefield of dark gaps and swollen gums. But the oddest part, they weren't self-conscious. You pass through a village where no one flinches at missing molars, blackened stumps, or bloody rags pressed to swollen cheeks. Pain was just part of life. Dental agony was as normal as hunger, as cold, as war. You find an old tooth wrapped in ribbon, stored as a charm, believed to ward off illness or bring luck. There is even a bizarre fringe belief that if you buried a rotten tooth beneath a new moon, your next one would grow and strong and white. Superstition and suffering made strange bedfellows. You linger near a monastery where a brother records dreams of saints who promise perfect smiles in the afterlife. Heaven, apparently, had no cavities. You chuckle, but it makes sense when your every waking hour is filled with aching jaws, bleeding mouths, and the metallic temps of decay. The idea of divine dentistry is oddly comforting. Even art reflects this. You stroll past paintings where demons are shown, yanking souls by the teeth, where sinners clutch their mouths as punishment, as if rot was both physical and spiritual. There are sculptures with intentionally crooked smiles, a reminder that even beauty was ephemeral. One peculiar scholar in a dusty library argues that medieval Europeans didn't truly understand oral health. because the mouth itself was taboo, a place of sin, of speech, of sensuality. To focus too much on it would be immodest. Better to let it rot in silence. And yet, despite everything, you find moments of gentleness. A mother gently rubbing mint leaves on her baby's gums to soothe teething. A traveling merchant selling toothpicks carved from bone, passed off as Roman relics. A young monk who smiles shyly, his teeth surprisingly white, who claims to brush with salt every morning as an act of quiet rebellion. These tiny gestures whisper through the ages. Not everyone accepted decay. Some fought it, however quietly. And as you pass a cemetery, where a skeleton grins up from the soil, its few remaining teeth stained by centuries, you understand that dental hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't about what people knew. It was about what they endured. It was about facing pain, stench, loss, and surviving it, sometimes with a crooked smile, sometimes with none at all. You scratch your scalp and pause as your fingers meet something small and crawling. Just pretend for now. But that tiny movement is enough to pull you into the itchy, infested reality of medieval hair care, or rather, the lack thereof. You wander through a bustling marketplace, and everywhere you turn, people are scratching, swatting, and shrugging in irritation, all of them caught in a never-ending battle with lice and fleas. It's not just the poor, though they suffer worst. Even nobles in their high towers are constantly dealing with the minute armies that crawl under collars and along hairlines. Lice combs made from bone or wood are sold by street vendors, as if they were relics of magic. But everyone knows they're barely effective. You duck into the home of a baker's family, and there, right by the hearth, a child sits patiently while her mother drags a thick-toothed comb through her tangled hair. The comb is full before she's halfway through, and the mother sighs as she drops the crawling contents into the fire. The sizzle is satisfying, if momentarily, but tomorrow it will all begin again. You reach up reflexively, imagining the crawling sensation, and realize this was a daily ritual for many. The idea of shampoo, let alone conditioner, is completely foreign. People rarely wash their hair, and when they do, it's with water that's either cold, muddy, or boiled with herbs that don't do much more than mask the inevitable stink. Hair oils are used sparingly, usually a mix of animal fat and crushed flowers, but they're more about managing tangles than keeping lice away. The fringe remedy of rubbing onions or garlic into the scalp circulates in some villages, and while it may deter a suitor, it does little for insects. As you explore further, you discover that hair itself was viewed differently, less a personal statement, more a container of burdens. Monks shaved their heads into tonsures, not just as a sign of humility, but also to reduce the area lice can hide in. Women cover their hair with wimples or veils, partly for modesty, but also to create a barrier against infestation. The head becomes a battleground, and privacy is a luxury. In communal sleeping areas, like monasteries, inns, and peasant homes, people share not just stories but parasites. A single louse can become hundreds within a week, and they spread through straw bedding, wool cloaks, and even shared headgear. Historians still argue whether people genuinely understood the life cycle of lice, or if they just thought of them as inevitable companions, part of the ecosystem of human suffering. Some texts suggest attempts to banish them spiritually with prayers or charms sewn into clothing, while others record odd rituals, like sleeping with a slice of bread tied to the scalp to lure the lice away from the body. You roll your eyes, but honestly, What else could they do? The concept of a sterile environment was non-existent. And then, just when you think it couldn't get itchier, you encounter the plague of fleas. You enter a barn where both humans and animals sleep side by side, and the floor is alive with movement. Fleas are everywhere, thriving in the dirt, the hay, and especially in the layers of grime on skin and clothes. They bite without mercy, leaving behind welts that become infected, especially when scratched with already dirty nails. You watch as a blacksmith rubs his calf with ash, a crude attempt to dry the bites and soothe the sting, but his legs are covered in scabs and boils. Fleas are more than a nuisance, they're vectors. Though medieval folks don't know it, fleas are partly responsible for spreading the Black Death. You shiver at the knowledge and look around, seeing a world where plague can erupt at any moment because no one can stop a flea from biting. One curious fact you overhear at a tavern: some nobles believed placing a smelling satchel near their bedding could repel fleas. Rose petals, lavender, and clove-stuffed pouches dangle from bedposts like charms. But of course, the fleas bite through even the softest silk. In the absence of solutions, people resort to shaving. Yes, entire heads are sometimes shorn to try and reset the infestation clock. A shaved head may signal illness or punishment in some cultures, but here, it's often a relief. Women hide their baldness under elaborate veils, and men may keep caps on at all times, both to hide the look and to avoid the shame of admitting defeat. Wigs make a surprising appearance, though they're not the powdered, towering styles of later centuries. They're simpler and often made of human hair or animal fur, stitched into cloth caps. You try one on in a mirror and immediately regret it as you imagine the unseen cargo wriggling through the seams. Lice don't die just because they're separated from the body for a few hours. They lie in wait. In fact, entire wardrobes are infested. You visit a noblewoman's closet and see gowns that haven't been washed in months, maybe years. They are beautiful, short gold thread, rich velvet, but closer inspection reveals larvae, eggs, and specks of insect feces. The maid assigned to care for them sighs as she shakes out the folds of a dress, hoping the insects fall out before they're worn again. Washing clothes is too expensive, too dangerous in winter, and rarely done thoroughly. Instead, garments are aired out or beaten with sticks. The idea is not to clean, but to dislodge. You start to feel your skin crawl as you realize every layer from underclothes to outer robes could be teeming with life. And still, they adapt. You sit by a fire and watch a peasant couple turn their shirts inside out to confuse the lice. It's a strategy based on folk belief, one you now know didn't work, but you can't help but respect the optimism. Some households keep hedgehogs to eat lice off bedding, a fringe practice with just enough truth to sound believable. Other homes burn sage or wormwood in closed rooms to smoke the pests out, though it often just makes the air thick and miserable. There's a subtle class distinction here too. The wealthy are more likely to have access to imported powders or perfumes to cover the scent and maybe smother the bugs, while the poor just endure. But make no mistake, everyone has lice. It's the great equalizer. And yet, somehow, vanity persists. You witness a noblewoman spend hours having her hair braided, even though she knows lice are present. Beauty is pain, but more than that, it's stubbornness. People cling to ritual, routine, even glamour, despite the itch. You find manuals written by monks and physicians offering advice of it practical, like combing daily and washing with vinegar. some of it bizarre, like smearing crushed frogs on the scalp to drive lice away with their cold essence. Historians still debate whether these texts were genuinely believed or more aspirational, a way for the literate class to signal their superiority. What's clear is that no one, not even kings, could claim to be truly clean. One king, Estari, mentions having to stop a war council because his underarms were bitten fiercely. The parasites had no respect for rank, and the psychological toll, you feel it, the constant distraction, the social awkwardness, the sleep disturbed by invisible feet. Children are taught to ignore it, to hide it, to scratch in private. You catch sight of a servant girl breaking down, her scalp red and raw, her tears falling quietly as she apologizes to her mistress for letting the lice win. And it hits you. This wasn't just poor hygiene. It was a war of attrition, a daily humiliation that chipped away at dignity. And yet, some found humor in it. You hear jokes about priests whose sermons were so boring even the lice left, and folk songs about lovers so infested they couldn't kiss without scratching. Satirical drawings in the margins of books show knights in armor battling fleas instead of dragons. You laugh uncomfortably because the truth is too relatable. Lice and fleas weren't just pests, they were part of the medieval human experience, stitched into every tunic, every bed, every scalp. They were uninvited guests at every feast, every prayer, every birth and death. And as you walk away from the candlelit world of braids and bugs of oils and odd cures, you start to realize that medieval people weren't tea-dirty by choice. They were survivors in a world that offered few options and even fewer answers. So you scratch again, this time not out of imagination, but empathy, knowing full well that if you were truly there, you'd be scratching constantly too. You pull on a tunic, stiff as bark, and immediately feel the crusty texture press against your skin. Not itchy like lice, but something more enduring, more rotten. Welcome to the world of medieval clothing, where the fibers don't breathe, and the smell could probably be declared a public menace. You glance around and realize that people aren't swapping out outfits for the day or the week. They re-wearing the same set of clothes for months, sometimes years. That's not exaggeration. It's just life. You're surrounded by peasants whose homes are built from straw, dung, and wattle, and they own perhaps 2 outfits work clothes and church clothes. And the good outfit isn't even clean. It's just marginally less foul. Linen underclothes are worn beneath woolen tunics, meant to absorb sweat and oils. But those underlayers are rarely washed. Once soiled, they're simply dried and reused. You walk into a village laundry hut and see steaming cauldrons filled with lye and urinates, literal human pews to whiten the linen. The acrid smell hits your nose like a slap, and you quickly step back. Laundering is an ordeal, often done once a season at best, because it takes precious firewood, time, and water to even attempt it. And forget about washing wool garments. Wool shrinks, felts, and rots in water. So instead of being cleaned, outer clothes are aired out or beaten with sticks to dislodge dirt. Imagine thwacking your favorite hoodie on a stone wall every week and calling that maintenance. You trail a laundress to the riverbank, where she soaks clothes and then lays them in the sun, not just for drying, but for bleaching. You spot stains that have clearly survived multiple summers and wonder if the sun is doing anything at all. The fringe advice circulating in apothecaries involves rubbing cloths with crushed rosemary or thyme, not for cleansing, but to mask the odor. You pick up a pair of hose hanging by the fire, and they practically crackle. They haven't been washed in months, but someone will wear them tonight. Unironically, it gets worse. You step into the room of a knight, expecting more refined habits. His clothes are better stitched, more luxurious, but not cleaner. His linen undershirt is brown around the collar and stiff with sweat. His cloak smells like horse, firewood, and something sour, probably wine or blood or both. You watch as his squire brushes mud-encrusted food off with a bristle brush, then hangs it back up as fresh. This is routine. Rich or poor, people just didn't wash clothing often. The exception, sometimes, was underwear if a person even had any. You hear a fringe story told by a traveling minstrel about a noble woman who owned 7 pairs of linen, chemises one for each day of the weekend. It's spoken with such awe. UD thinks she was royalty, but even she had to air them out by the fire, as washing all 7 regularly would be unthinkable. Historians still argue whether people avoided washing clothes purely due to practicality or if superstition played a part. There are folk beliefs suggesting that washing clothing in winter could invite disease, that cold water chilled the soul and made the body vulnerable. Others claim that excessive laundering was considered wasteful or even vain, a sin in the eyes of the church. And you can't ignore the gendered dynamic. You pass a group of women gossiping while scrubbing a noblewoman's gown with sand and vinegar. They talk about how men's tunics are beyond salvation and how women's petticoats are judged more harshly if stained. In a society where cleanliness isn't possible, the standards are still uneven. One quirky fact emerges as you sit by the fire. In a tavern, some people believed wearing specific colors could repel dirt. Browns and dark greens were popular because they masked stains, and blue was seen as a sign of divine protection. Others wore charms pinned to their cloaks, hoping to ward off soil and disease. Did it work? No, but it felt like doing something, and in a world with few choices that mattered. You watch a merchant shake out his doublet, and a cloud of dust and hair lifts into the air like confetti. No one reacts. This is normal. His sleeves are shiny with skin oil, his collar crusted white with salt from endless sweat. You think of your own clothes and suddenly appreciate the miracle of detergent. He folds the doublet neatly and packs it away for the next town, never once considering washing it. You walk into a church, expecting divine cleanliness, but even here, you see the same grime. Priests wear vestments heavy with incense and mold, stiff with wax drippings and age. The robes are rarely laundered. Perhaps once a year, during Easter, you touch the hem of one, and your fingers come away sticky with centuries of accumulated sanctity. And still, clothing mattered. Appearance mattered. You hear a noblewoman scold her maid for not arranging her train correctly, not because it was dirty, but because it didn't flow gracefully. Dirt was accepted. Clumsiness was not. Embroidery and fashion thrived despite the smell. Rich people commissioned garments made with gold thread and imported silk, layering these over bodies that hadn't seen soap in weeks. The effect was paradoxical. The higher the status, the more elaborate the outfit, the worse the actual hygiene. And it all comes down to presentation. You see a nightgown, a tunic stiffened with beeswax to make it keep shape. It rustles like parchment, and beneath it, he's sweating through 3 layers of wool. But to onlookers, he's polished, princely, untouchable. The illusion holds, even if you're gagging from 2 feet away. Then there's the problem of vermin. Mice and rats chew through clothing stored in chests. Moths lay eggs in unwashed wool, and you find ruined surcoats and half-eaten cloaks piled up in noble attics. Clothing is currency, often more valuable than coin. People are buried in their best garments, and thieves often rob graves for the clothes alone. You hear of a fringe tale where a monk was excommunicated for stealing a bishop's robe, not because of the theft itself, but because wearing it unclean defiled the holy vestment. And Shuso, don't even get started. Leather boots are never cleaned, merely scraped of the worst muck. You step into one and feel the dampness of someone else's sweat, preserved like a forgotten memory. The insides are stuffed with straw, cloth scraps, or sometimes nothing, and they're worn until they fall apart. New shoes are a luxury. Most people patch old ones until the soles flap like tongues. You witness a cobbler stitching a slipper so thin it might as well be paper. Then, the layers. People wore multiple garments not for style, but necessity. Wool kept you warm, and layering offered some protection from filth, but it also trapped body heat, sweat, lice, and bacteria. The result, a walking stew of skin cells, oil, and embedded stink. Taking off clothes wasn't routine, it was an event. And Laundry Day, a community-wide upheaval. You see women gather at the river only a few times a year, soaking, scrubbing, and gossiping. Children splash nearby, but even they understand the water is tainted. Sometimes ashes are added to the water to create soap, an early version of lye-butted S. So caustic, it burns hands. Still, it's better than nothing. Yet many people choose nothing. Clothes are simply reworn until they rot off the body. You come across beggars wearing patchworks stitched together from multiple generations, fragments of fashion long past. The colors are faded, the fabric threadbare, and yet there's pride in every stitch. You pass a peasant woman who proudly declares that her overdress once belonged to her grandmother, worn through to births and a famine. You nod, unsure whether to admire or pity. Scholars debate whether clothing filth was entirely due to poverty or partly ideological. Some monks wore unwashed robes as a sign of humility. Pilgrims on sacred journeys avoided changing clothes, believing their stench showed devotion. Dirt, in some cases, became symbolic, even revered. A traveling friar tells you he hasn't changed his tunic since Lent, and beams with pious pride. You smile weakly, trying not to breathe through your nose. In the end, you understand something deeper. The medieval world wasn't lacking awareness, it lacked access. Water was scarce, soap expensive, firewood precious. Clothes were mended, repurposed, and respected, even when disgusting. And cleanliness, as you know it, was an alien luxury. So you return to your stiff tunic wrap, your musty cloak around your shoulders, and remind yourself that to survive back then meant accepting that your clothes would never truly be clean. They'd just become part of you, a second skin soaked in history, hardship, and sweat. You step into the perfumed haze of a medieval court, expecting sophistication, perhaps even a reprieve from the stench that's been following you for days. But within moments, your nose wrinkles. Not because it smells bad, no, quite the opposite, but because the air is so thick with cloying, unrelenting fragrance that it feels like you've even dunked in a vat of spiced wine and wilted roses. This is the aristocratic solution to body odor. Don't clean it, just cover it up. Nobles and the rising merchant class drenched themselves in oils, pomanders, sachets, and distilled floral waters, but none of it removes the grime clinging to their bodies. It simply declares in bold olfactory letters that they are above the need to wash. You move closer to a lady of the court, her gown embroidered with pearls, her hair arranged in an elaborate lattice, and as she tilts her head to speak to a nearby knight, you catch the unmistakable whiff of lavender mingled with sweat. The scent is not unpleasant. Exactly, it's just complicated, like someone trying too hard. And they are trying too hard. All of them. You realize quickly that smelling good has become a class marker. Where peasants walk around with a raw, earthy musk, nobles opt for layers upon layers of citrus water for the hands. Ambergris tucked in pockets, rosemary vinegar splashed under arms, but underneath it all, they're just as dirty. A quirky tidbit comes to mind. Queen Elizabeth I supposedly bathed only once a month. Yet her attendants recorded that her wardrobe was full of scented gloves, embroidered with herbs and soaked in aromatic oils to mask the reality beneath. You reminded of this as you pass a nobleman leaning in to kiss the ring of a visiting bishop. His gloves emit a sharp citrus scent that does battle with the bishop's own clover-scented pomander swinging from a chain. Historians still argue whether these perfuming practices were purely cosmetic, or whether they were genuinely believed to protect against disease. After all, this was a time when bad smells, miasmas, were thought to cause illness. So when nobles carried sachets of herbs, or wore plague necklaces made of camphor and dried flowers, they weren't just being fancy. They believed they were shielding themselves from death. That camphor ball you see dangling from a chain around the Duchess's neck, it's not jewelry, it's medicine. She believes that the strong smell will purify the air around her and keep the Black Death at bay. And who can blame her? You walk through a crowded feast hall where meats roast on spits and wine flows from barrels, and the heat of dozens of unwashed bodies rises in waves. To survive here, your best weapon is scent. You watch a servant sprinkle rose petals on the floor, not for romance, but for deodorizing. In noble houses, herbs like sage, hyssop, and lavender are scattered underfoot, crushed beneath shoes to release their fragrance and mask the rot of spilled food, animal dung, and unwashed humans. But these efforts are limited to the wealthy. You step outside and pass through a market square where perfumed vendors hawk their goods, alembics filled with flower distillates, pouches of dried juniper, cones of frankincense meant for burning in home hearths. But these are luxuries. Most commoners can't afford a vial of rose oil, much less use it frivolously. So instead, they adopt simpler hacks, rubbing mint on the wrists, chewing fennel seeds to sweeten the breath, or, bizarrely, placing dried orange peels in their hats to carry a faint aroma. You meet a cobbler who boasts about his perfumed shoes, not made with scent, but filled with moss and sage, a homemade filter between his foot and the world. The irony, of course, is that none of this makes anyone cleaner. Perfume doesn't wash away filth. It layers over it like makeup on a sunburn. You crouch beside a washerwoman who confesses that her employer once instructed her to soak his shirts in elderflower water instead of washing them just to refresh the smell. You ask her how often she's allowed to actually clean the garments with water, and she laughs, shaking her head. Once a season, maybe. Yet the illusion of cleanliness persists. In the court, a person's scent becomes part of their reputation. There's a quiet war of smells happening. Who has the most exotic fragrance? Whose odor can linger in a room the longest? Who has mastered the art of hiding their humanity beneath olfactory armor? You walk past a perfume workshop and peek inside. Rows of stills steaming with crushed petals, tinctures steeping in alcohol or fat, and assistants filtering oily liquids into small glass vials. These aren't hobbyists. These are professionals supplying the elite with what they consider a hygiene solution. The process is laborious. Some perfumes are created through enfleurage, using animal fat to absorb the scent of flowers over weeks, even months. Others rely on distillation, passing steam through plants to extract essential oils. You watch as a perfumer gently folds a beeswax-sealed package and explains to a merchant that this batch is particularly strong intended for plague season. The merchant nods grimly, already planning how to market it to panicked nobles. And all the while, no one considers bathing. It's not that people are unaware of dirtits. That dirt is inevitable. And battling it with water is inconvenient, even dangerous. So they turn to scent. A popular belief floats through the halls of medicine that opening the pores with bathing allows disease to enter the body, making you vulnerable. Better to stay dry and perfumed than clean and sick. You hear a friar preaching that those who smell too sweet are inviting vanity and sin, but his robes, despite his sermons, smell faintly of myrrh. You can't escape it. Everyone is scented. You visit a brothel, expecting chaos and sin. But what surprises you most is the fragrance. Every room reeks of cinnamon, musk, and clove. The madam explains that clients expect a certain ambience, and so she boils herbs daily and burns resin at night. It's all performance. You remember that fringe tidbit you overheard in the tavern, that some nobles carried hollow apples filled with perfumed sponges and would discreetly inhale them during public gatherings to avoid the smell of others. You even see one used in a cathedral. A noblewoman lifts her pomander to her nose during mass, trying not to retch as incense mixes with body odor from the peasants crowding behind her. Perfume becomes not only armor but barrier, separating the civilized from the rest. But despite the luxury and effort, you notice how little control people have. By midday, the heat overwhelms even the strongest fragrances. Sweat seeps through embroidered collars. You pass a nobleman whose doublet smells like spoiled wine beneath its clove overlay. His handkerchief, monogrammed and perfumed, is used not to clean, but to dab at his forehead, smearing scent into grime. And the worst part, everyone gets used to it. You do too. After a few weeks in this world, you stop noticing the baseline smell of filth and rot. What you do notice is when someone doesn't smell like anything. That's the anomaly. One day, a foreign merchant arrives from Venice, his clothes crisp and washed, and the entire court whispers about how he smells like water. They say it like an insult. You watch him stand alone, confused, while others shuffle away, unable to understand his sterility. Clean has become foreign, alien, even dangerous. You're left with the absurd reality that in a world without sanitation, scent doesn't equal hygiene, it equals survival, status, and sometimes superstition. It's a language of its own. You can tell a person estrate by their aroma. The tanner reeks of hides and lye, the cook of grease and smoke, the barber surgeon of iron and vinegar. Each scent becomes a name, a label, a way to identify and judge. You wonder what you smell like now. Probably everything. And so, You close your eyes and imagine what it must have been like to be considered clean, not because you bathed, but because you smelled like roses and cedar and clove. Not because you were healthy, but because you carried a pomander made of gold. In the medieval world, perfume wasn't vanity, it was protection, illusion, and class rolled into a drop of oil. And you, like everyone else, are just trying to survive the stench of reality by breathing in something any. You step out of the perfumed corridors and back onto the medieval streets. And the shift is jarring, immediate, even violent to the senses. The air turns heavy again, not with roses or cloves, but with the unmistakable stench of decay, filth, and something far worse. Animal waste. It clings to everything: the cobblestones, the wooden carts, the folds of your tunic. Even the fog seems to carry the sour breath of 1,000 beasts. You blink, trying not to gag, as a horse cart rattles by, its wheels streaked with manure that splashes lazily onto the sides of buildings. And you wonder how anyone lives like this. But they do, and not only do they live, they function. Trade, flirt, argue, pray, all within sniffing distance of a literal pile of dung. It's everywhere, inescapable. Horses, pigs, goats, chickens, even dogs and cats roam freely through the town, dropping their waste wherever they like. Nobody cleans it up, not really. There are no sanitation workers, no sewage system to carry it away. Instead, it accumulates in corners, between uneven flagstones, in front of doorways, in alleyways so choked with muck that your shoes make a wet, sucking sound when you lift them. You sidestep what looks like a decaying goat carcass and nearly step into something fresh or warm, steaming, definitely from a horse. You look around, and nobody else reacts. A merchant curses the weather, but not the pile of feces in his path. Children skip around it, their feet bare, their faces smeared with dirt and innocence. You see a boy chasing a pig through a puddle that's clearly not just water, and you flinch. Welcome to the medieval city, where waste is both backdrop and fact of life. There is no way to exaggerate how omnipresent animal waste was in daily life. Because livestock wasn't tea, just common, it was essential. People lived in close quarters with their animals, especially in rural towns where families shared one-room cottages with a cow for milk or a few chickens for eggs. The animals didn't have pens, they had corners. You walk into such a cottage, ducking beneath a low thatched roof, and the air inside is thick with smoke, sour milk, damp wool, and the warm, earthy scent of cow. You hear snuffling in the dark and realize there's a pig sleeping near the fire pit. That pit is also where food is cooked, where clothes are dried, and yes, where the family warms their feet. The smell isn't offensive in Marit's background, but outside, in the town square, where animals mix with trade and trash, the scent is unbearable. You inch past a butcher's stall, where blood from hanging carcasses flows down into the street, mixing with runoff from a nearby tannery. The combination hits you like a wall. You've smelled rot before, but this is different, richer, meatier, and somehow sweet in the worst way. A rat skitters by, its tail slick with some unidentifiable gunk, and you shiver. There's no drain, no sewer, just gravity and time. Historians still argue whether towns had any real waste management systems. And while a few places like London or Paris eventually developed rudimentary street cleaning or designated dung heaps outside city walls, most of medieval Europe simply let the problem fester. Waste was dumped in middens, communal piles that often sat just behind or beside homes. If you were lucky, it rained. If not, the waste dried in place, only to be stirred up again with every footstep or cartwheel. One curious tidbit emerges as you pass a group of women gathering manure into baskets. Dung was valuable, not for hygiene, obviously, but as fuel. Dried animal waste was burned for heat or used to fertilize fields. So while the streets were covered in feces, some of it was actively collected and repurposed. That doesn't make it cleaner, though just more versatile. And that leads you to a peculiar image, a baker collecting donkey droppings to stoke his oven, the same oven where tomorrow's bread will be baked. You shake your head, unsure whether to be horrified or impressed. Meanwhile, the official system, if you can call it that, for handling animal waste was often just fines and ordinances that no one enforced. Town records sometimes mention penalties for allowing pigs to wander or for dumping waste too close to a neighbor's property, but these were rarely punished. In fact, pigs were often released to roam the streets specifically because they acted as primitive garbage collectors. They ate everything: scraps, spoiled food, human waste, even dead animals. You watch a black sow nosing through a pile of refuse near a tavern, her snout slick with something that glistens. She finds a rat corpse and devours it whole. You glance at the tavern's kitchen door, ajar, and try not to connect the dots. But you can't avoid the food chain. Waste and food exist in a continuous loop here. Animals wander freely, depositing feces, eating refuse, dying in the streets, and becoming food for other animals. Disease, unsurprisingly, follows close behind. Flies swarm everywhere, attracted to dung heaps and butcher stalls, landing just as happily on bread loaves and ale mugs. You swat at one and wonder how many illnesses were spread by these tiny, uninvited dinner guests. Back then, nobody knew about bacteria, but they understood, vaguely, that waste brought disease. That's why some towns, especially after a plague outbreak, tried to regulate where animals could roam or when dung had to be cleared. But enforcement was spotty, and priorities shifted quickly when hunger struck. You step into a courtyard behind a monastery and find a makeshift stable filled with goats. The monks explain that they use the goat droppings to enrich their garden soil. You nod politely, then notice the compost pile, thick with both plant scraps and animal waste, sitting dangerously close to the monastery's water well. You don't drink anything that day. Even the castles weren't immune. You ascend the muddy slope to a minor noble's fortress and expect, perhaps naively, a more refined setup. But as you cross the drawbridge, the smell hits you anew. The inner courtyard teems with livestock, their pens overflowing, droppings smeared into the ground by soldiers' boots and horses' hooves. There's no separation here between warrior and waste. You notice a servant flinging something from a bucket over the wall, more manure, casually disposed of into the moat below. You peer over the edge and see the water, once meant as a defensive feature, now functioning as an open cesspit. Frogs croak somewhere beneath the brown film. The noble greets you with pride, gesturing toward his livestock and boasting about his wealth. You nod, eyes watering. In wealthier towns, there were attempts, noble ones, even architectural ones, to contain or manage the mess. Some cities developed open gutters or kennels running along the streets, designed to carry waste away. But more often than not, these channels clogged with refuse, and unless it rained, The waste sat stagnant, attracting insects and releasing gases that made even hardened city dwellers wince. You remember reading that people tried to time their errands after a rainstorm when the streets were cleaner. That's a relative term. Still, the worst offenders were often the wealthiest, whose stables and horse traffic concentrated in city centers. You see this clearly in a merchant district where horses from distant caravans crowd a square. Their dung forms steaming hills in the corners. A servant hurries by, trying to sweep it into a pile, but she's fighting a losing battle. The pile grows faster than she can manage. And in this cycle, the human element is always nearby. Children run past, their shoes slick, their games adapted to avoid the worst patches. A woman empties a bucket into the street, adding something that looks suspiciously like human waste to the animal mix. It's all the same to the cobblestones. One misstep and your boot sinks in. You lift it free with a squelch. No one notices. This is life. You return to the edge of the town, where fields begin, and see farmers collecting manure again, this time not for burning, but for spreading on their barley crops. The wagon load of waste rattles past, flies in tow. You imagine the process. Animal eats grain, defecates, manure fertilizes next season's crop, which feeds another animal, which repeats the cycle. It's efficient. It's disgusting. It's medieval hygiene. So much of daily life centered around dung, not just as a nuisance, but as a necessary part of survival. The line between utility and filth was thin. You imagine trying to explain modern plumbing to these people and laugh quietly. What would they say if you told them your streets are cleaned daily? Your waste vanishes with a flush. Your food isn't grown in a slurry of feces and flies. They might admire you, or they might worry that you're too clinty soft. Because here, waste is a tool, a smell, a hazard, a resource, a constant. You walk back into town as the sun begins to set, the air thickening again with the day's heat and waste. A pig squeals in the distance. A cow lows. You feel the filth beneath your feet and realize, for a moment, that you no longer mind. Not because it's better, but because you've grown used to it. Just like they did. Just like everyone did. You make your way deeper into the shadows of medieval life, where filth isn't just inconvenient, it's fatal. Disease crouches in every alley, every rat scurry, every gulp of water you dare to drink. And as you step into this treacherous terrain, you start to notice something sinister. No one really knows what causes illness, but everyone has their theory, and most of them are horrifyingly wrong. You pass a physician in long black robes, his beak-like mask stuffed with herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, not because they're medicinal, but because they help mask the reeking air. This is the plague doctor, that almost mythic figure now turned historical symbol. And yes, he believes smells can kill, not metaphorically, literally. Haze here because of miasma, the bad air thought to rise from rotting waste. Swampy ground, unburied corpses, and anything else that offends the nostrils. The belief is that sickness floats invisibly through the air. A ghostly presence that creeps into your lungs if you breathe in too deeply. So people fight it with incense, burning rosemary in the streets, waving posies in front of their noses, or lighting pitch and tar to fumigate their homes. You walk through one such street now, its corners blackened from recent fire, still smoky, and locals swear it's helping. Historians still argue whether miasma theory made things worse by delaying the acceptance of germ theory. or if it accidentally led to better practices, like cleaning up waste or avoiding foul-smelling areas. Either way, it dominated medieval medical thinking for centuries. But disease, as you're about to discover, doesn't wait for consensus. It strikes brutally, leaving confusion, superstition, and shallow graves in its wake. You glance to your left and spot a heap of bodies, some wrapped, some not, laid hurriedly near a churchyard that's already full. The plague has been through here. Black Death, bubonic horror. In 1347, it arrived on ships from the east, and within just a few years, it killed over a third of Europe's population. You move through a village still reeling from it, where dogs bark nervously and bells toll for yet another victim. No one approaches you. No one touches anyone. Even families have begun to leave food outside doors and mourn from a distance. You notice talismans hanging from thresholds, coins tied with string, small dolls, garlic. A priest chants softly, swinging a censer, while nearby, a man drenches his shoes in vinegar, convinced it will form a protective barrier. Quarantine as a concept barely exists, but fear is very real, and fear creates strange rituals. People stop bathing, believing water opens the pores and makes one vulnerable to the poisoned air. Some wear masks smeared with feces, convinced it blocks out worse odors. You overhear a conversation where someone suggests that avoiding meat on certain days will prevent infection. Another blames the alignment of planets, and someone else whispers a more dangerous theory, that the Jews poisoned the wells, that lie spreads like fire, and before you can process it, you're in the middle of a mob dragging a man from his home, shouting, cursing, accusing. No evidence, no proof, just fear. You turn away, sickened, but history doesn't pause. It barrels forward with all its mess and momentum. You head into the countryside, where you hope things might be cleaner, safer, but no. The disease follows. Without sanitation, even rural communities become breeding grounds. You step into a farmhouse and find a child with pox-ridden skin lying on a straw mattress soaked with sweat. The parents look helpless. The local healer arrives not with medicine, but with leeches. He applies them carefully, saying the blood must be balanced, the humors aligned. You want to scream, to stop him, to hand over penicillin, a thermometer, soap, but all you have is silence. And so the healer continues, oblivious to his futility, proud of his service. You stay the night and hear stories over cold porridge. A neighbor who buried 5 children in a week, a wife who dropped dead. Mid-meal, a bishop who declared that dancing until sunrise could cleanse the soul and body alike. You look out the window and see torchlight, a group of flagellants marching by, chanting, whipping themselves, seeking God's mercy. Their backs are raw, their eyes wild. They believe pain purifies, that suffering can end the suffering. But the plague doesn't care about faith or devotion. It takes who it will, when it will, and still, the waste lies everywhere. Animal dung, human refuse, spoiled food, all mixing in gutters. Rain does little, it just spreads the filth into broader pools. Water sources are contaminated constantly. Wells stand too close to outhouses, and rivers carry not just waste, but the bones of the dead. You remember hearing that during the height of the plague, some cities ran out of burial space entirely. In London, they created mass graves plague, pits where bodies were stacked like firewood. You walk by one now, and even centuries later, your imagination fills in the rot, the weight, the silence. Not everyone believed in miasma. Some clung to older, stranger beliefs that sin itself caused disease, a moral failing, God's punishment. And so they turned inward, confessing, fasting, flagellating. Others went the opposite, root partying furiously, drinking until they passed out, dancing in graveyards. You step into a tavern where the air is thick with sweat and ale, and someone jokes about death while coughing into their sleeve. Laughter rings out, hollow and desperate. They know they're next, and they've decided not to die sober. Amidst this chaos, a curious fringe theory emerges, one that historians still debate. Some thinkers propose that filth itself acted as a kind of immunity. They claimed that those who lived in constant exposure to waste built up stronger bodies. The cleaner you are, the sicker you'll get, they said. And bizarrely, some anecdotal records supported it. A stable boy might survive while a bishop perishes. Was it coincidence? Or was there something in the constant low-grade exposure that helped? Scholars disagree. You remember hearing about plague houses, homes marked with a red cross, quarantined by force. In some towns, they'd board up the family inside and simply wait for them to die. A barrel of water might be left outside, maybe a loaf of bread once a day. But mostly, the family would be left to rot behind their own door. You pass one such house, the red cross still faintly visible, and the hair on your neck rises. Someone touches your shoulders, the local apothecary, offering you a waxy salve for protection, made of crushed rose petals, bear fat, and mercury. You decline. He shrugs and smears some on his own neck. You head to a monastery next, hoping for reason, for peace, maybe even cleanliness. And sure, there's prayer, quiet, and order, but also sickness. Monks share chambers, food, and clothing. When one gets ill, the whole abbey follows. The scriptorium smells of musty parchment and faint vomit. A monk coughs blood onto a manuscript. You quietly step back, but in one corner, you find something unexpected. A record, a carefully drawn diagram of how illness spread within the walls. Who died first? Who was spared? It's primitive epidemiology. A monk mutters something about patterns. Hayes noticed that those who handled waste fell sick faster. You ask if he thinks the waste causes disease, but he shakes his head. No, he says, the devil enters through the air. Still, he marks the connection. It's a start. You step outside and find yourself blinking in the sunlight, shocked at how bright it is after all that shadow. A breeze carries the scent of lavender from a nearby field. You breathe it in, grateful. Then notice that the field is bordered by an open trench moor, bodies half buried. You turn away, back toward the town, and the wind shifts. Now you smell it again. Rot, smoke, dung, and death. Always death. The plague wasn't the only illness, of course. There were countless other typhus, smallpox, dysentery, cholera. Each one had its own symptoms, its own superstitions, its own tiny trail of suffering. And in each case, waste played a role. Dirty hands, unwashed utensils, contaminated food, shared bedding, communal wells, no germ theory, no sterilization, no understanding, just guesses, just fear, just hope. Some cities tried to do better. Venice introduced quarantine laws in the 14th century, forcing ships to wait 40 days before unloading. Others experimented with isolation, pest houses, even early public health boards. But progress was glacial, inconsistent, and often reversed by political pressure or religious protest. You pass a scholar who insists that the plague is caused by a rare alignment of Saturn and Mars, and another who says it's a punishment for loose women. Neither suggests building a sewer. You reach the edge of the city again and spot a caravan arriving travelers from the next province. The guards hesitate, then let them in. Within a week, the city's bells will ring again. You keep walking, the path winding through forest and meadow, trying to leave the smell behind. But it lingers, not just in your clothes, but in your memory. A world where filth wasn't just part of life, it was the stage, the backdrop, the invisible hand moving every piece. You realize the truth now. Medieval hygiene wasn't just disgusting, it was deadly. And in that darkness, with all its tragedy and confusion, humanity still survived, bruised, bloodied, baffled, but alive. And if that doesn't make you appreciate your indoor plumbing, nothing will. You continue your slow march through the rank underbelly of medieval hygiene, and just when you think things can't possibly get any weirder, you step into the bewildering world of DIY medical self-care, or, as they called it back then, medicine. You're greeted by a woman stirring something thick and brown in a pot over an open fire, muttering a prayer under her breath. The concoction, she tells you, is for her husband's bad humors and includes crushed onions, goose fat, and a healthy dollop of his own urine. You smile politely, but the stench punches you in the face with full medieval enthusiasm. And it's not just her. Everyone, it seems, has a homemade cure, a superstitious belief, or a family recipe passed down through generations, all in the name of health and hygiene. You'd think that in a world this filthy, people would simply give up, but no, they try, endlessly and earnestly, even if their efforts look more like medieval torture than medical care. You hear a boy wailing in the distance and follow the sound until you find a local barber surgeon cheerfully preparing his bloodletting tools. Dull knives, leeches, and a bowl to catch the blood. The patient, a scrawny adolescent with nothing visibly wrong, is here for a seasonal balancing of his humors. It's Wednesday perfect for draining melancholy. The boy trembles. The barber slices, and the blood begins to drip, dark and sluggish. You try not to faint. This was standard practice. People truly believed that the body was governed by IV fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow biland. That illness came from imbalance. Want to feel better? Just lose a pint or two. Historians still argue whether humoral theory prolonged medical ignorance or gave early medicine a working framework. But standing here now, with a kid nearly passing out from anemia, you're leaning toward ignorance, and yet you keep going. A woman in the next house is suffering from swollen joints. Her daughter is rubbing a warm paste on her knees made of dried beetle powder and molasses. Across the room, her son is boiling willow bark in wine to treat his headache. A surprisingly clever use of salicinan, early form of what would become aspirin. Not all their methods are nonsense, you realize. Some remedies worked, even if no one knew why. But for every success, there's an absolute horror. You find a man applying mercury to a leg wound, unaware it's poisoning him slowly. Another is gargling vinegar and sheep bile for a sore throat. You duck into a stable and catch a glimpse of a woman placing a toad on her chest to cure a cough. The toad draws the sickness out, she explains, as it tries to escape. When it finally dies, she breathes a sigh of relief, proof, in her mind, that the illness has left her. Further down the lane, a family gathers to create a poultice for boils, made of bread soaked in wine and spider webs. The webs are fresh. They had to be. You resist the urge to scratch your own arms as you watch. But what really makes your stomach churn is how frequently people turn to urine. Human urine, specifically. It's used for everything: washing wounds, cleaning teeth, curing earaches. You watch a father instructing his child to pee into a wooden bowl, then dab it on a scab with a cloth. Cleans the rot, he says. Urine was thought to be sterile, a kind of internal filter. You step back, horrified, yet fascinated. This isn't hygiene, it's survival theater. Still, the reliance on natural ingredients is impressive. People gather herbs from the wild: yarrow, comfrey, feverfew, mugwort. You even hear a tale of a cure-all, soup made with 12 different flowers and holy water. Another family uses crushed garlic and raw honey on wounds, something modern medicine recognizes for its antibacterial properties. But before you get too hopeful, a neighbor tells you about swallowing live frogs to cure whooping cough. He's done it twice. Didn't work either time. You enter a cottage where a baby is being treated for colic. The mother is swinging him upside down, gently, while reciting a rhyme and sprinkling salt in a circle. Keeps the demons out, she whispers. In another home, a man with a toothache is biting down on hot coal. His brother offers to knock the tooth out with a hammer if the pain continues. You nod politely and back away. Dentistry, such as it was, mostly involved brute force. You hear of people wrapping threads around their rotting molars and tying the other end to a door. A swift slam and voile-instant extraction, minus the anesthesia. Tools are scarce, but creative improvisation is endless. Animal bones become scoops, wooden sticks become tongue depressors, and fish bladders are used as makeshift gloves in rare surgical procedures. You stumble into a local apothecaria wooden hut stacked with jars labeled in spidery Latin. Inside, ground horn, dried lizard tails, preserved bat wings, all stored next to rose petals and chamomile. The apothecary is a wizened man with ink-stained fingers and a twinkle in his eye. He offers you a cure for melancholy powdered pearl and saffron and goat milk. You decline, but he insists on showing you his prized ingredient: mummy powder. Yes, ground up remains of ancient Egyptian mummies, imported and believed to hold healing power. It was all the rage for a time. You back out quickly. The line between medicine and mysticism is thin here. Astrology dictates when to administer treatment. The phases of the moon determine when bloodletting is safe. Healing is often accompanied by chanting, candles, and relics. A woman shows you a holy bone fragment she places under her tongue during illness. Cured my fever, she says proudly. Further along, you meet a group of women accused of witchcraft. Their crime: knowing too many herbs. Their ability to help people frightens the men of the village, who prefer prayers to poultices. You quietly take note of one woman's advice: boil nettles and mint for congestion. The smell actually helps, but their fate is grim. A local priest believes their cleanliness and knowledge are signs of devilry. They will likely be driven out or worse. It strikes you how dangerous knowledge can be in this world, especially when it threatens authority. You walk on and hear of a traveler who claims to have found healing in isolation. He lives alone in a cave, bathes daily in cold river water, eats only garlic and oats. He hasn't been sick in 10 years. People visit him like a shrine, bringing offerings. Is he lucky or onto something? Historians still argue whether such figures were dismissed as eccentrics or quietly revered as proto-scientists. The traveler offers you a sip of herbal tea. You accept. It tastes like moss and firewood. You make your way to a manor where the nobility try their hand at hygiene. A young lady applies a mask of crushed pearls and rose oil, believing it will ward off both pimples and plague. Her brother drinks wine laced with powdered emeralds, certain it makes his blood unassailable. A servant tells you she once saw a noblewoman wash her hands before dinner, and the court was scandalized. What was she trying to prove? Cleanliness often equals arrogance in these circles. You reach a monastery again, where monks are copying ancient medical texts. One manuscript recommends smearing fox lungs on your chest for tuberculosis. Another suggests swallowing ground glass for constipation. You suppress a shudder, but in the corner, one monk has begun compiling notes on what actually works. He's charted every remedy, every death, and every recovery. He believes something beyond faith is at play, perhaps patterns, perhaps particles. His peers call him mad. You silently hope he lives long enough to finish his notes. As you walk the road back into town, you notice something strange. The people around you are trying, desperately, creatively, sometimes dangerously, but trying. There is effort here, even if it's misguided. There's love in every failed remedy, hope in every bizarre tonic. A father uses his last coin to buy a dried newt. A mother sings to her child while applying ash and vinegar to a rash. These people aren't lazy or ignorant. They just don't have the tools. And maybe, in their own way, they are laying the foundation for something better. You pass a healer who boils her tools before use. She doesn't know about bacteria, but she's noticed fewer people die that way. Another insists on boiling drinking water after losing her brother to dysentery. These are the sparks. You can almost hear the centuries turning. By now, your senses are numb to the smells, the screams, the strangeness. You've seen more urine, leeches, and poultices than you ever wanted. But you also understand something deeper. That medieval DIY hygiene was not a failure of care, but a testament to human resilience. People did what they could with what they had, and even when the world stank of death and dirt, they kept trying to heal, to soothe, to survive. You take one last look at the sky. It's dark now, the stars barely visible through the smoke of 100 chimneys, and you realize that even in a world this disgusting, this broken, there was dignity in the attempt. You step quietly into the lives of medieval women, expecting perhaps some hint of mystery, maybe a flicker of elegance in the way they navigated a world so harsh, so hostile to their existence. But what you find instead is something far grittier, far more raw, unfiltered look at how women managed hygiene in a time when cleanliness was barely an afterthought and the female body was treated with suspicion, fear, and a startling lack of understanding. And the first thing that strikes you is the heavy silence that surrounds the topic of menstruation. Not just in whispered conversations, but in written records too. As if centuries conspired to collectively pretend that half the population wasn't bleeding monthly. And yet, despite the social squeamishness, you uncover how women still had to manage it, using folded cloths, wool pads, even moss in some rural areas, all held in place by makeshift belts or tight-laced underwear if they were lucky enough to own any. And it becomes painfully clear that these materials weren't changed, often partly due to scarcity and partly because there was no concept of microbial cleanliness, which means infections were common, irritation was constant, and shame was absolutely routine. And what's worse is that menstruation was considered not only unclean, but downright dangerous. With one local midwife telling you in hushed tones that a menstruating woman's gaze could spoil milk or wither crops. And she genuinely believes it because her grandmother told her so, and no one ever dared challenge it. And as you watch a young girl press dried herbs into her wool pad, whispering a prayer to Saint Apollonia for pain relief, you realize how layered this ignorance really is. How it weaves together fear, faith, and folklore into a suffocating blanket that wraps around every woman's body from adolescence onward. And the superstitions don't stop their childbirth. Too is an arena soaked in misunderstanding and filth. And when you crouch inside a peasant's hut during a nighttime labor, you feel your throat close from the heat and the smell and the sheer closeness of it all. The mother groaning on a bed of straw, surrounded by women chanting psalms, burning juniper, and hanging iron tools on the wall to ward off demons. Because birth wasn't just a biological event, it was a spiritual battlefield. A moment when the veil between worlds thinned and evil could slip in if you weren't vigilant. And so they stayed vigilant, boiling water, not to clean instruments, but to pour on the floor to ward off spirits. Tying red ribbons around the mother's ankles, rubbing her belly with goose fat mixed with ash. And if things went wrong, and they often did, there was no surgeon to step in. No sterile scalpel or emergency room, only the midwife's hands and whatever prayers she could offer in between, compresses and whispered reassurances. And historians still argue whether medieval midwives were wise women preserving ancient knowledge or just perpetuators of harmful myths. But in this moment, watching her work with calm eyes and shaking fingers, you suspect she's both, holding lives together with whatever scraps of skill and belief she's managed to inherit. And once the baby comes, assuming it survives, it's immediately swaddled tightly, almost alarmingly, so because a crooked body was believed to result from loose wrapping. And then comes the ritual washing, not with soap or even clean water, but with mixtures of wine, salt, or in some cases, crushed flowers and goat's milk. And as the baby screams, you see a flicker of pride in the mother's eyes, but also exhaustion, not just physical, but existential, because the months ahead offer little rest, little privacy, and certainly no sanitary relief, especially when postnatal infections are treated with honey or moldy bread pressed into the wounds. And the idea of washing regularly is laughable when you consider that most people believed cold water could make a new mother ill or even sterile. So she stays warm, wrapped, untouched by clean water for weeks, even months, depending on the community's traditions. And you start to realize that the very idea of women maintaining hygiene was not only difficult, it was sometimes actively discouraged, with the church frowning upon excessive grooming as vanity and physicians warning against over-cleansing the womb, which was seen as a self-purifying organ that should be left alone. And this belief that the female body cleans itself is part of why so little effort was made to understand or support women's hygiene. And as you walk through a market and pass a stall selling vinegar-soaked cloths for feminine odor, you hear a vendor cheerfully proclaim that the product also doubles as a floor cleaner, and somehow that feels symbolic, as if the cleanliness of a woman's body and the scrubbing of a filthy floor are spiritually linked in the collective medieval mind. And then there's the matter of hair, body hair, head hair, pubic hair, all managed differently depending on class, region, and religious influence, but universally viewed through a lens of control and suspicion, with long unkempt hair associated with wildness or witchcraft, especially if a woman dared wear it loose past a certain age, and pubic hair was sometimes shaven not for hygiene, mind you, but to prevent lice and allow better application of mercury ointments used to treat venereal diseases, which were rampant and poorly understood, with treatments often causing more damage than the illness. And in noble circles, women perfumed their hair with lavender oil, sometimes hiding unwashed locks beneath elaborately pinned veils, while peasant women tied scarves over their greasy braids, not out of modesty, but to keep soot, ash, and insects from nesting in their strands. And even so, lice were a constant companion, leading many women to sleep with combs beneath their pillows and inspect each other's scalps by firelight, like apes grooming in the wild. And yet, despite all this discomfort, despite the dirt and the danger and the cultural disdain, women still found slivers of ritual and dignity, like the act of washing their hands before kneading bread, or bathing together in a stream once a season, or placing rose petals in their undergarments before attending Mass. Tiny acts of rebellion against a system that expected them to suffer silently and smell awful while doing it. And you notice that these acts are passed woman to woman, not written in books or taught in monasteries, but whispered, demonstrated, quietly preserved. An oral hygiene tradition built on resilience and repetition. And while men held the official positions of doctor, priest, and philosopher, it was the women who carried the knowledge of how to soothe, to clean, to survive. And yet they were the ones most often punished for it, branded as vain or dangerous, even heretical. With one woman you meet confessing she was fined by her local bishop for selling a homemade skin balm because it was seen as interfering with God's plan for suffering. And you can't help but marvel at the cruelty of a world that offers no soap, no safety, no sympathy, and then punishes you for trying to create your own. And so as you follow one young girl home, watching her carefully arrange her scrap of linen for the night, tuck her hair into a makeshift cap, and sleep curled around a dried bundle of lavender to mask the odor of her body, you're struck not by how dirty she is, but by how hard she's trying not to be. And you finally understand that medieval women weren't passive victims of a disgusting world. They were active, desperate, ingenious agents of their own well-being, navigating a minefield of filth, fear, and folklore, armed with nothing but scraps of cloth, bundles of herbs, and the inherited wisdom of women who had survived before them. And maybe that's what makes this section the most heartbreaking of all, not the dirt, but the effort it took to rise above it. You slip into the echoing silence of a medieval monastery, the heavy oak doors groaning behind you, and you brace yourself for what monastic hygiene might look like, half expecting that monks and nuns, with their vows of poverty, would live in utter filth. But what you discover is far more layered, almost contradictory, because on one hand, these holy men and women were bound by routine, and routine included forms of washing. But on the other hand, their spiritual obsession with humility and self-denial often overshadowed any practical concern for genuine cleanliness. And so you find them living in a weird balance between rules about purity and a deep-rooted fear of bodily pleasure, which meant bathing was never a free, happy event, but a reluctant duty, scheduled rarely, supervised carefully, and done in icy water because warm baths were thought to inflame lust. And you shiver as you watch a novice monk dipping his feet in a freezing basin, scrubbing off days of grime with an expression of total misery. And he does it not for comfort, but because his superior told him to do it, following the monastic rule, which usually allowed a full bath just a few times a year, though foot washing happened more regularly since Christ had washed his disciples' feet, and that made it acceptable, even spiritually profound. But otherwise the emphasis was on soul cleaning, not body cleaning. And as you wander the cloister halls, you see a nun's cell lined with herbs, bunches of lavender, rosemary, and sage hanging in fragrant bunches to repel lice. A practice historians still argue whether it was more about spiritual symbolism or genuinely meant to ward off pests. And the debate makes sense because in this environment, symbolism and practicality blur until they are impossible to tease apart. And then there is the latrine, or reredorer as they called it, a large stone room that sits cold dark, sometimes running along a diverted stream, its holes lined up in neat rows without any real privacy, so that monks could relieve themselves side by side while maintaining communal humility. And it is so drafty and damp that the stench never fully leaves a permanent haze of ammonia woven into the monastery's walls. And it seems the monks tried to manage it with rushes scattered on the floor and lime poured down the drains. But the sheer volume of men meant there was no escaping that sour reek, and wiping was done with bits of cloth or moss or even a water-washed hand, depending on what the monastery could afford, with no sense of embarrassment because that was not a luxury granted in the disciplined world of a cloister. And you have to remind yourself that these men and women often came from noble backgrounds, and yet here they were, squatting over a communal trench, no better off in bodily dignity than the lowliest peasant. And if you look to their spiritual writings, you see how proudly they bore that humility, treating the rejection of private comforts as a holy virtue. And you start to see how the church hierarchy used this as a lesson, encouraging the faithful to believe that their bodies were filthy, sinful, and best ignored. Their minds turned instead to the cleansing fires of faith, and so monks would punish themselves for any hint of softness, refusing a bath after hard labor, choosing to itch and suffer in lice-ridden robes, because to scratch was a reminder of the flesh weakness, a notion that seems brutal to you, but was foundational to their worldview. And yet even here, you find curious moments of human contradiction, like one abbot who insisted on a regular facial rinse with rosewater to stay dignified in public, or another who secretly ordered better soap from Italian merchants to wash his undergarments, proving that even the holiest men sometimes cracked under the relentless grind of medieval dirt. And the nuns, meanwhile, managed their periods with remarkable quietness, fashioning absorbent wool pads that they washed in scalding water before discreetly hanging them behind the laundry screens so no men would see. And you can practically feel their dread at being discovered, because although menstruation was recognized, it was shrouded in a shame so deep that even holy sisters would rather burn their rags than have them discussed openly. And you stand there, hearing a nun softly chant a prayer over her wash bucket, aware that in her mind, this isn't about hygiene, it's about penance, about the stain of Eve's sin, about what it meant to be female and therefore burdened. And your heart breaks a little for her, because you know she has no soap that could ever wash away the cultural dirt pressed onto her skin since birth. And outside, a monk tends the herb garden, where medieval monastic communities grew medicinal plants like mint, yarrow, wormwood, and sage, using them to make balms and teas to treat wounds, parasites, and fevers, though bathing with these herbs was still minimal. And you wonder how they tolerated the stink of infected sores and sweaty robes without going mad. But the answer is in their chants, their bells, their books, their endless hours of prayer, drowning out the body with the power of repetition. And that is how they coped, letting their sense of smell dull to the reek, letting their eyes glaze over the sight of lice, burrowing at a neighbor's scalp, letting their minds drift to a purer place where flesh did not matter. And this near deliberate neglect of bodily care was seen as holiness, the denial of self, the triumph of spirit. Though, ironically, it created entire breeding grounds of contagion, spreading scabies and lice and even leprosy through monastic houses faster than they could ever pray it away. And when a plague struck, the monasteries fell like dominoes, their close quarters and pitiful sanitation turning them into death traps. And you catch yourself marveling at how the greatest centers of knowledge in Europe could also be the filthiest places in the countryside, with scholars scratching their heads over Aristotle by candlelight while scratching their own flea bites. And you sense the tragedy of wasted wisdom, how a monastery's library could hold Greek treatises on hygiene copied word for word, but those words meant little if their culture refused to act on them. And so a monk might know a Roman bath routine in theory, yet still choose to wallow in his own filth as a sign of devotion, because that was the spiritual path. And you even see water carefully preserved for ritual purity in a baptismal font, shimmering like a tiny blue jewel. Yet nobody would dare use that same clean water to wash their feet, because that would profane it, the logic twisting back on itself until you can barely follow. And one of the more peculiar details is that in some orders, monks were required to sleep in their habits without ever changing them year after year until the cloth literally rotted off their backs, a tradition they believed would kill off vanity, but usually just killed off the monk from skin infections, and you are left staring at these gentle, faithful faces, trying to reconcile their compassionate prayers with the misery they endured. And you remember how one chronicler described a medieval abbey's smell as like a foul sheep pen, which is both hilarious and horrifying. And you wonder how any of them could meditate while their nostrils burned. But they did, clinging to visions of paradise, believing their spiritual fragrance would outshine their bodily decay. And somewhere, deep in your bones, you suspect that is what kept them from giving up. The dream that one day they would stand clean before their God, washed not in water, but in grace. And you reflect on how that dream, no matter how misguided, must have given them a strength modern people can hardly fathom. And so, as you tiptoe out of the monastery, past the flickering candles and echoing prayers, you leave with a bittersweet respect, because these monks and nuns, for all their dirt and fleas and ritual awkwardness, still tried to live by a code bigger than themselves. And even if their bodies suffered, their hearts found purpose in the suffering. And maybe that is why the echoes of their chants still linger soft and stubborn through stone walls darkened by centuries of unwashed hands. You step through the warped wooden gates of a medieval village for the last time tonight. But now something's shifting. No longer are you wading through the reeking sludge of hygiene, gone hopeless, because this time something faint glimmers in the air, something cleaner, crisper almost, hopeful. And though your boots still squelch into muddy ground, and your nose still twitches at the nearby pigsty, there's a tiny, almost imperceptible change underfoot and overhead that tells you this is not quite the same festering mess of centuries past. Because slowly, painfully, slowly, the medieval world begins to question its relationship with filth, and you watch as towns, once lax and indifferent, start issuing ordinances about where waste can be dumped and who has to clean it. And yes, the enforcement is a joke and the fines are laughable, but the fact that they exist at all is a revolution in itself. And you trace the reason back not to soap or science or even common sense, but rather to death, the Black Death. To be exact, because when half your neighbors die, frothing at the mouth, you start connecting dots, even if those dots are more superstition than science. And though they still cling to miasma theory, blaming bad air for plagues, you see a shift in behavior as people begin trying to combat smells with herbs, fumigation, and eventually the quarantining of ships and travelers. And you're watching the seeds of public health form, clumsy and flawed, but undeniably growing. And it's not just towns that change, but the individuals too. Because gradually there's this shift in attitude where cleanliness starts to feel less like vanity and more like virtue. And historians still argue whether this was due to changing religious views, rising trade connections, or simply plague fatigue. But you stand on this threshold moment where someone finally decides to boil their laundry, not to show off, but to stay alive. And in wealthier circles especially, you see the rise of linen underclothes, changed more frequently than outer garments, which keeps the skin just a little cleaner, the body just a little less irritated. And you're almost proud watching someone scrub themselves down with a cloth dipped in vinegar, because even if it's crude, it's effort, it's awareness. And even the Catholic Church begins to soften its rigid suspicion of bathing, still wary of sin, of course, but less likely to scold those who wanted a soak before Mass. And then comes the slow rebirth of the bathhouse, not the communal semi-scandalous stews of earlier centuries, but private bathing chambers in wealthier homes, fed by rudimentary pipes and filled with water that might even be warm if you timed it right. And while your peasant still bathes in the river when forced, your merchant class is slowly embracing the idea that soap and water might be worth paying for, especially when entertaining guests. And perfume no longer tries to mask rot, but rather enhance cleanliness, especially in the courts of France and Italy, where scented gloves, sachets, and floral oils begin to suggest refinement, not just disguise. And there's a strange irony here, because while science hasn't quite caught up, the pressure of social appearances is doing what medical wisdom couldn't, convincing people to wash. And of course, cities like London and Paris remain deeply gross for centuries to come. Don't get it twisted. But you're seeing the roots of change stretch out like tendrils through the muck. As streets are finally cobbled, as waste disposal becomes a matter of civic pride, and as trades like soap making and apothecaries take off, providing things like tooth powders made of salt and charcoal, and homemade lotions that, while often containing lead or mercury, still point to a growing obsession with outer appearance and body maintenance. And meanwhile, inside homes, the humble chamber pot evolves into the more decorous commode, often stowed inside cabinets or disguised as furniture. And though the contents still end up in the street half the time, people are beginning to think about privacy and sanitation in new ways. And by the late 15th century, in places like Bruges and Florence, there are even early versions of sewers being laid, primitive, yes, but functional. and the mere idea of waste management becomes a conversation, and you realize you're standing at the edge of modern hygiene culture. Not quite within it, but staring at its reflection in the muddy puddles of the past. And one of the more remarkable shifts happens in medicine. As surgeons and physicians begin documenting the importance of cleanliness in wound care, especially during war, because a battlefield infection kills more men than swords ever could. And this leads to sterile dressings, boiled instruments, and an awareness that filth isn't just unpleasant, it's dangerous. And women, too, lead the charge at home, creating cleaning rituals, herbal infusions, and household systems for tidying, laundering, and bathing that, while still limited by resources, reflect a growing consensus that the body deserves care. And even menstruation, long shrouded in mystery and stigma, begins to be managed more openly, with cloth pads washed regularly and stored discreetly in linen drawers instead of hidden in terror. And childbirth sees incremental improvements as midwives adopt practices like hand washing and warming linens, small miracles in a world still struggling to grasp. Germ theory, and you remember how once monks sat in stone, silence letting lice nibble at their scalps. But now those same monastic libraries are copying books that include notes on hygiene, even if buried between psalms, and suddenly, the whole cultural landscape is tipping toward a new horizon where the body once treated as sinful and shameful becomes something to protect, to cherish, to cleanse, and there's resistance. Of course there always is, but the wheel has turned, and it won't turn back. Not now, not when people can smell the difference, literally and metaphorically. And the Renaissance, bubbling just beneath the surface, will soon explode with ideas about health, anatomy, and balance, turning the dirty body into a sacred geometry. And even though plumbing won't be commonplace for centuries, and diseases still ravage towns, there's now a pathway, a momentum, a shared idea that maybe the world doesn't have to stink forever. And that's what you carry with you as you step out of the village, leaving behind the sewage-stained gutters, the lice-infested bedding, and the sour stench of unwashed centuries. Because while medieval hygiene was absolutely disgusting, it was not static. It moved painfully, slowly, but undeniably toward something better. And that journey, in all its gross glory, is what finally brings you here. Blinking into the future with just a little more gratitude for your indoor plumbing, your hot shower, and your minty toothpaste. So now, listener, as you gently breathe through your nose, blessedly free of medieval stench, and feel the comfort of clean sheets around you, let the echo of that world fade into the mist. You've trudged through muck-laden alleys, ducked beneath airborne chamber pot surprises, and tiptoed past flea-bitten monks, chanting in their lice-riddled robes. But it's over now. The stink fades. The noise softens. You're here, in the quiet now. Let your mind, still brushing off that imaginary dust, begin to slow, like a flickering candle preparing to go out. The world you left behind was so far from ours, harsh, filthy, and strangely human. But you made it through, and now you can feel yourself ease, limb by limb, thought by thought. Let the air grow still around you. Let the grime of all that imagining fall away like old cloth, leaving you lighter, calmer. The medieval world won't follow you here, just its stories, and in this gentle place, those stories can rest, too. You're safe, clean, warm. Let the silence stretch. Let your breath be slow and full. You've traveled far enough for one night. Sweet sleep is just ahead.